now that we've talked about all of the processes of memory and how we retain information, let's talk about how we forget things or how we distort our memories. So first of all, forgetting is the inability to retrieve information. And this inability to retrieve can be because we have poor encoding of the memory, poor storage, or poor retrieval. So forgetting can happen anytime during the memory process. There are lots of different reasons why we forget information, and you need to understand all of them and how it is a memory failure. So not only that it is that this is why we forget, but also why does that make it a memory failure? So let's start with the types of forgetting. The first is encoding failure. This is we cannot remember what we did because we didn't encode something, right? We weren't paying attention to it, or we didn't rehearse it enough to enter into our long-term memory. Just because it happens doesn't mean we're going to remember it. Our memory is not magic. So think about this. When you're in a room and you're not paying attention to something, you're not going to remember what the teacher is saying if you're not paying attention, right? Because you've physically not encoded it. Another is storage decay. Basically, our stored memories, if we don't use them, we lose them. So we decay. They're not fully deleted usually, so we don't get rid of the memories, but they decay, they break down. We remember less and less of things. This happens when maybe the loss of a loved one, right? Like, so right away you can remember everything about that loved one, what they sounded like, some of what their smile looked like, all of that. But then over time, because you're not using that memory and going back to it again, your memories are going to decay. They're going to get less and less. And then finally, retrieval failure. Retrieval failure is that we cannot access the retained information. So this is for a number of reasons, and we're going to talk about the different types of retrieval failure. But the idea is that we somehow get confused while we are trying to remember it. So let's talk about encoding failure first. I want you to look back at your encoding notes, specifically where we talk about the memory effects, so the next in line effect, the spacing effect, and the serial positioning effect. And I want you to think about how each of these are encoding failures, how we have not actually encoded the material, and now we're not going to remember it because we never actually encoded it to begin with. Okay, so think about that, maybe write it down underneath those so that you can really realize that it's not necessarily that we are not looking at those things, it's that we're not paying attention to them. Okay, storage decay. So the person that we refer to with storage decay is Hermann Ebbinghaus, and you're going to hear about him a lot. And he came up with the forgetting curve. And this is the idea that if we don't rehearse information, we have an initial drop of retention. Okay, so initially we'll forget some info, but it evens out over time. There's some things that are going to stick with us. We believe this is due to the gradual fading of memory traces in that brain. Remember, the memory trace is the idea of that cornfield that you're constantly walking over it, right? The connections aren't as strong and as efficient, and so we forget it. However, if we review the material or relearn it, meaning we use the information again, that curve starts to even out. It's not quite as drastic as this original first learning of material. When Ebbinghaus was doing this study, he used nonsense syllables. So basically it would be a sound, right? But they were in no particular order. He did this because he didn't want his subjects to use meaningful words because they could attach meaning. So he wanted to use nonsense syllables that would not mean anything to people so that he could truly see the memory and not just associating meaning with it. So now that we have seen this forgetting curve, what does this line tell you about what you are learning right now? That if you just watch this one time, or if you just review this one time, you're not going to remember it very well. You're going to have to go back and review the material in order to truly retain this information. So the forgetting curve was also looked at by Barek. He did similar research, but instead of just looking at a few days, he looked at memory over a long-term scale. So over years, not just a few days. And what he found is that the biggest loss of information is in those immediate years right after learning it. After that, our retention is pretty steady over time. But those first few years, if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. Okay, retrieval failure. Tip of the tongue, remember how we talked about that? Tip of the tongue is a retrieval failure, okay? However, the main retrieval failures that you'll need to know is interference. And there's two different types of interference. But the idea of interference is that information blocks the retrieval of other information, okay? That's the idea. Just like pass interference in football, how someone is blocking the reception of a football, same thing goes here, right? When information blocks the retrieval of other information. So we have two of them, proactive interference and retroactive interference. These are two of the most confusing terms that you will see in this entire course, okay? So we're going to do a number of things to try and remember proactive and retroactive interference, okay? But let's talk about each of them first, just so you have the information, and then we'll talk about how you can remember them, okay? So proactive information is when old information blocks the retrieval of new information. So the actual definition is when old information interferes with the retrieval of new information, but you can't use that on an FRQ because you need to be able to show that you understand what interference means. So you need to cross out where it says interferes with and write blocks, okay? So when old information blocks the retrieval of new information. So for example, if your cell phone was stolen and you have to get a new phone and a new phone number, but now someone asks for your phone number and you give your old one, okay? So the old information, your old cell phone number, is blocking your retrieval of your new phone number. That's proactive interference, okay? So old information blocks new information. That is the idea of proactive interference. Retroactive interference, then, is when new information blocks the retrieval of older information. So, for example, in calculus class, you can't remember how to solve a geometry question when your younger sibling asks for help because all you can think about right now is your calculus. You can't think back to those basic geometry ideas, okay? So that new information that you're learning in calculus is blocking the retrieval of the geometry, okay? So proactive is going to be old information blocking the new. Retroactive is going to be new information blocking the old. This is where we are going to use the acronym PORN, and we're going to talk about it in class and how to use it. But proactive, old information blocks the new. Retroactive, new information blocks the old, okay? So one thing that we have noticed, however, when studying this interference is that sleeping immediately after you've learned something or studied something actually aids the retention of that information. The idea is that our memory is being consolidated while we sleep. So if you study right before you go to bed, it's going to help avoid retroactive interference, okay? So if you're studying, you go to bed, you're not getting any new information that's going to block that information you've studied, okay? So try this, study right before bed, then go to bed. Don't go on your phone, don't watch TV, study, go to sleep, and then wake up and see if you remember it better. Okay, another type of forgetting is motivated forgetting. So we unknowingly revise our memories, okay? We don't remember items we don't want to. Our brain might not want to remember certain things. For example, women who've had children know that it hurts, but they are motivated to forget the pain of childbirth because they now have this cute little baby in their arms and they want that again. Okay, that's motivated forgetting. Repression is an example of this. Repression is a defense mechanism given to us by Freud that banishes anxiety-arousing thoughts, feelings, and memory from consciousness. The idea is that we repress things that make us really anxious or afraid. So why do we forget? Well, forgetting, like we've said, can occur at any memory stage. We, however, filter, we alter, or lose a lot of that information during the stage. So think of these as like all of the information that you have at one point, right? So sensory memory gives us momentary amazing detail, right? We have a ton of detail about the place that you're looking at or the pictures that you're seeing. Then our short-term memory or working memory, only a few items can be noticed. We can only pay attention to a few things. And those are the things we're going to encode. Then we rehearse some things and we get them to our long-term storage. However, some of these items are going to be altered or they're going to decay over time. Okay? And then our retrieval from our long-term memory depends on the interference that we have, the retrieval cues that we have, our mood, our motives of whether or not we want to remember something. So really, this amount of things we actually retrieve and retain is going to be pretty low. But not all memory loss is due to factors of forgetting. Some memory loss can be structural, so damage to the brain. So let's talk about it. Amnesia. Amnesia is the partial or complete loss of memory due to physical or psychological damage. So amnesia is not just us forgetting something because we forgot it. Amnesia is due to some sort of physical or psychological damage to our brain. Okay? So we can have physical damage, which could be Alzheimer's disease, another disease, a stroke, brain trauma. All of those are physically altering to our brains, right? But we also have psychological damage. Psychological damage could be triggered by a traumatic event. And most of these memories return over time, usually within a few days. So if you go through a really traumatic event, you might not remember some things right away because your brain is so focused on recovering from that traumatic event, but then in a few days you're going to get it back, okay? So there's two different types of amnesia. There's anterograde amnesia and retrograde amnesia. And you're going to need to know the difference between the two, okay? So anterograde amnesia is the inability to remember ongoing events after the incidence of trauma or the onset of disease that caused the amnesia. Basically, once you get the damage to your brain, you can no longer create new memories. Okay, so you can still remember everything that happened before. Okay, so let's say, excuse me, you get in a car accident and you have brain damage when you're 16 years old. You can still remember everything that happened before you were 16, before that car accident, but you're not going to make new memories of things that are happening after. Okay, that's anterograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is the inability to remember events that occurred before the incident. So if we're using our car accident example, you can still create new memories, okay, but you're not going to remember things from before you were 16. Okay, so from the moment of that crash, you cannot remember before, but you can make new memories and remember things after. That's retrograde. Okay, the key to remember is asking yourself where the memory lost. Where is the memory loss? Is the loss for the memories before the traumatic event or after? That's going to tell you which one it's going to be.